And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Consortium News has a piece, NATO Summit. Alliance's Endgame appears to be nuclear war. A hostile military alliance, now including even Sweden and Finland, is at the very borders of Russia. Chris Wright asks how Russian leaders are supposed to react to this as the NATO Summit kicked off in Washington. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
The world is at its most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Back then, however, the fear of total destruction consumed the public. Today, few people seem even to be aware of this possibility. And Dr. Horne, you know, in listening to these references to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we've talked about this with a few other guests in the previous hour, what all too often seems to be omitted in the Western media so-called analysis is a lot of the so-called threats that the United States continues to claim that it's responding to are actually responses to threats to other countries by the United States.
Well, clearly, I mean, there's been so much hysteria in the U.S. media in recent days and weeks, I don't know where to start. Recall that just a few weeks ago, there was a friendship visit of a Russian flotilla to Havana. You would have thought that missiles were about to be launched from Cuban soil. Then there was the Wall Street Journal article about so-called Chinese spy bases on the island of Cuba. And of course, that leads us directly to the most recent communique from NATO, which singles out the People's Republic of China for special attention. It's clear that the leaders in Washington of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization do not understand geography. Otherwise, they would not be focusing on the leading Asian nations, speaking of China. But you only need to look at the recent alliances that are being knocked together. Speaking of the attempt to draw Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and particularly Japan into a coalition to target Beijing. I dare say that India, which also had been slated for this cabal, might not necessarily be playing the role intended by Washington in light of the visit to Moscow, still ongoing, of Prime Minister Modi. However, having said that, we cannot downplay the hysteria and the danger that we face. And I trust and I hope that there will be folks marching on the NATO Summit sooner rather than later.
You know, Dr. Horne, one of the issues that I think NATO has is whatever they're going to do, they ain't got a lot of time to do it. And here's what I mean. Pretty much most of the leaders that we saw here in town, you know, they got one foot in the political grave and the other on a patch of ice, as it were. I mean, we're seeing that the NATO so-called leaders do not in any way represent the people, and that people, as we see what happened in France, et cetera, that these leaders will be gone, that people are looking for someone who will take them in a different direction. We're starting to see that happen in Europe in some areas based on the recent elections. What are your thoughts?
Well, clearly you have a point. I mean, look at France, for example, where the New Popular Front, led by Mr. Mélenchon, who is quite critical of NATO, came in number one in terms of parliamentary vote. Coming in third, expected to come in first, was the party of Madame Le Pen, who similarly is hostile to NATO. And then, of course, you have the lame duck, speaking of President Macron, termed out in 2027, facing a hostile parliament led by Mélenchon. And then you go across the channel to Great Britain, or Sir Keir Starmer got only 33% of the vote for his Labour Party, but because of, I guess you could say, official electoral rigging, got 65% of the vote. And then, of course, you have these right-wing populist forces like Nigel Farage of the Reform Party running to the right of the Tories at 14% of the vote. The Liberal Democrats running to the left of the Tories got double digits in terms of seats. And then what I'm really concerned about is that Mr. Biden and his comrades in NATO might be trying, as they say in Washington, to Trump-proof NATO. That is to say, there are two different strategic approaches for U.S. imperialism right now. One is represented by the Democrats, which is to weaken Russia so as to get leverage against China, and the other by Mr. Trump to cut a deal with Russia and then go after China. In order to foil Mr. Trump, who does not have very nice and kind things to say about NATO, the United States, under Mr. Biden, might seek preemptively, believe it or not, to somehow launch an attack, some sort of preemptive attack that would tie the hands of any incoming U.S. administration, not to mention helping to consolidate the present warmongering against Russia in particular. In that regard, we should not be indifferent to the fact that the outgoing foreign minister of the European Union, speaking of Mr. Borrell of Spain, is being replaced by an Estonian hawk whose solution to every problem is to turn up tensions with Russia in particular. So once again, this is a very perilous moment. And only thing I can advise, in addition to having folks take to the streets, it's also to pressure the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives, in particular in Washington, to stay true to its name of being progressive. I would also encourage our friends in the international peace movement to reach out to their compatriots across the Pacific, particularly in South Korea, where President Yoon is quite weak. And I would say the same thing with regard to Tokyo, where the current prime minister similarly is quite weak. And we should also be careful about being sucked in to other diabolical plots. What I'm referring to is the fact that Mr. Orbán, the leader of Hungary, is for 6 months the leader of the European Council. And in that regard, he has been engaged in diplomacy in Kiev and Moscow, Beijing, coming to the United States, I understand, to meet with Mr. Trump. But as I understand it, whatever his right-wing populist philosophy might be, Mr. Orbán is not necessarily on board with regard to the warmongering of NATO. And so it will be a simple thing, perhaps, to trap many of our progressive friends in some sort of scheme to destabilize his peace efforts. But there are many, many reasons to attack Mr. Orbán, but trying to wage peace is not one of them.
And to your point, your reference about the article about protecting NATO against Trump, the other line in that headline is, and protect the fledgling alliance, because there's great concern that that NATO itself, whether it's due to Donald Trump and his machinations, or whether it's just due to NATO has run its course, they're very concerned about whether or not NATO will be around in another few years.
Well, that's for sure. I mean, you need only look at the travels of Mr. Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, the eastern flank of NATO. I'm sure you must have noticed his conspicuous presence at the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Astana in Central Asia, in a former Soviet republic. This was quite curious, since the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is oftentimes seen as a counterpoint to NATO, and perhaps Mr. Erdogan, a sly figure, if there ever was one, is hedging his bets by having 1 foot in with regard to NATO and 1 foot out. And this is understandable, because Mr. Erdogan has been treated rather shabbily by his neighbors to the west, being blocked from the European Union repeatedly. His neighbors to the west have allied with Greece, and you might say that religion plays a factor since Greece is predominantly Christian, and of course, Turkey is predominantly Muslim. But that's not the only factor we need to consider when trying to figure out what's going on with regard to the warmongers now conferring in Washington. I happened to catch the other day remarks by a card-carrying member of the U.S. ruling class, speaking of Bridge Colby. He was in a discussion with Matt Pottinger, who was the point man for Mr. Trump on China. They both have Mr. Trump Beijing in the crosshairs. But what was the takeaway from Mr. Colby's remarks was that looking back, he concluded that Putin is more troublesome to deal with than the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Now, if you take that comment seriously, you have to wonder what the United States was doing, spending trillions to bring down the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and then, according to Bridge Colby, winding up with something less than a prize. But if he were smarter and more intelligent, what he would have realized is that be there a czar in Russia, a communist party in Russia, or Putin in Russia, there are unbridgeable gaps between Russia and its neighbors to the west because it's the land bridge between the richest continent, speaking of Europe, and the continent of the future, speaking of Asia. It's the most populous European nation. It's the European nation with the most natural resources, be it natural gas, oil, gold, diamonds. And so what the warmongers in Washington, not to mention U.S. intellectuals and progressives, need to recognize is that irrespective of who's ruling in Russia, unless there's a sellout, decrepit drunkard like Boris Yeltsin, there's going to be tension. And that should be our North Star that helps to govern our strategy towards this bellicosity now about to plunge planet Earth into the abyss.
You know, additionally, there's a great article in Greenville Post, Vassalize Allies, Destabilize the Rest is now U.S. strategy in Indo-Pacific. And it's summed up in a sentence that says, for the U.S. to contain China must also mean impoverishment and instability for its neighbors intentionally or as collateral damage, which is exactly what's happening in Europe, Dr. Horne.
And I think that's one of the reasons why wiser nations and leaders are seeking to jump ship. You need look no further than the recently knocked together alliance of Sahel states, so Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, formerly under the thumb of French imperialism, but now have broken free. And indeed, if you look at Niger, they've ousted U.S. imperialism as well. And of course, the former alliance that they were a part of, speaking of the Economic Community of West African States under the hegemony of Nigeria and the puppet regime in Cote d'Ivoire, are both scrambling to keep from falling apart. And once again, to look at the home front, we should not see with indifference the fact that as U.S. imperialism now stands, the top leaders of the military, speaking of Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown, head of AFRICOM, the African Command, Lieutenant General Michael Langley, they're all men who happen to be black. And it's apparent that U.S. imperialism would like to lead black people astray, use us as cannon fodder, and in the bargain, foil us from brokering the kinds of global alliances that have rescued us from both slavery and Jim Crow. And of course, in that context, look at the Supreme Court decision, which sought to overthrow affirmative action, except for the military. So these are very dire times, my friends, and it requires more strategic thinking than we have all displayed to this point.
And to that point, there's so much focus on President Biden and so much focus on this upcoming press conference as he's so trying to salvage his, but there's no messaging other than Donald Trump is evil and democracy's on the ballot. But there's no substantive messaging, Dr. Horne.
Well, Mr. Biden and indeed the Democratic Party has a problem. On the one hand, they would like to paint, and with good reason, the Republicans as the party of neo-fascism and perhaps civil war. But they ignore the fact, the unavoidable fact, that the Democrats themselves are the party of imperialism, the party of foreign military intervention. You need look no further than Truman in Korea in the early 1950s, LBJ in Vietnam in the 1960s. And what happens is that occasionally these two parties switch roles. Recall that when U.S. imperialism invaded the Philippines in 1899, sending 6,000 black soldiers at the tip of the spear, this was done at the behest of a Republican Party administration, whereas the Democratic Party at that particular time, which had an armed wing called the Ku Klux Klan, was styling itself as anti-imperialist simply because it did not want Filipinos under the U.S. flag because of their melanin content. So once again, we need deeper analyses. More than that, we need more militant and progressive and radical action.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. And we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.